Ever wondered how prisons, the universal symbol of punishment, came into existence? Let's dive into the annals of history to find out. The origin of prisons can be traced back to ancient civilizations. The first known prisons were used in the Mesopotamian civilization around 4 millenniums ago. Back then, prisons weren't the large, complex structures we're familiar with today. They were simple holding areas, much like the police lockups of our time. The purpose was primarily to hold people who were awaiting trial or punishment. In ancient Greece, the concept of incarceration was quite different. Prisons were often underground pits or stone quarries. The infamous Athenian prison where philosopher Socrates met his end was actually a quarry. The Greeks, however, didn't use prisons as a form of punishment but as a holding place till execution or trial. Similarly, in ancient Rome, prisons were not used as punishment but a place of detainment. One of the most famous Roman prisons, Mamertine, witnessed the confinement of many high-profile prisoners, including reputedly St. Peter and St. Paul. But their prisons too were primarily meant for people awaiting trial or execution. Moving across to ancient Egypt, prisons were often part of palaces and courts. They served to hold debtors and those awaiting judgment from pharaohs. However, it's interesting to note that in ancient Egypt, punishment was often swift and brutal, reducing the need for long-term imprisonment. In the Far East, in ancient China, prisons were a part of the judicial system as early as the Shang dynasty. Like their counterparts in other parts of the world, these were primarily holding areas for those awaiting trial or punishment. So it seems the primary function of these early prisons was not to punish but to hold. They were a stopgap arrangement until the final verdict was delivered or the sentence carried out. It's a far cry from our modern understanding of prisons, where the incarceration itself is the punishment. So the concept of prisons isn't as modern as we might think. As we move into the Middle Ages, prisons began to take a slightly different form. This era saw prisons being utilized for various purposes beyond just detaining wrongdoers. One such use was as debtors' prisons. In a time when bankruptcy laws were non-existent, those unable to pay their debts were confined until they could settle their dues. Prisons were also used as holding cells for high-ranking individuals during periods of political instability. Kings, queens, and nobles often found themselves imprisoned, not for crimes committed, but as a strategic move in the chess game of power. These luxury prisons were far from the grim dungeons we often imagine, often resembling more of a house arrest than a stark cell. It's important to remember, though, that during the Middle Ages, incarceration was not yet a standard form of punishment. It was typically a temporary measure until the real punishment was meted out. Prisons were not yet used as a form of punishment, but that was about to change. The modern concept of the prison as a place of punishment began to take shape in the 18th and 19th centuries. This was a time of great social and political upheaval, a period when long-standing traditions were being questioned and new ideas were taking root. One of these ideas was the concept of the penitentiary. The penitentiary was a radical departure from the prisons of old, which were mostly just holding cells for people awaiting trial or execution. The idea now was to use imprisonment as a form of punishment in itself, a place where wrongdoers could be isolated from society and ideally reformed. This shift in thinking about prisons was largely influenced by the Quakers, a religious group known for their advocacy of social justice. The Quakers believed in the inherent goodness of all people and the possibility of redemption, even for those who had committed the most heinous crimes. Quakers were instrumental in the establishment of the first penitentiaries, advocating for a system that was more humane and just than the brutal conditions of the old jails. In these new institutions, prisoners would not just be confined, they would be given work to do, taught useful skills, and encouraged to reflect on their actions and the harm they had caused. The birth of the penitentiary was not without its controversies, however. Many at the time questioned the morality and effectiveness of this new approach to punishment. Critics argued that it was too lenient, that it coddled criminals and failed to deter crime. Supporters, on the other hand, argued that it was a more enlightened and civilized approach, one that respected the dignity of all people and promoted social harmony. Despite these debates, the concept of the penitentiary gradually took hold and spread throughout the world. It was a radical rethink of the purpose and nature of prisons, and it marked a major turning point in the history of criminal justice. This was a pivotal shift in the history of prisons, paving the way for the prison systems we know today. With the dawn of the 20th century, prisons saw another significant evolution. As the new century unfolded, so did the philosophy behind prisons. The focus began to shift more towards rehabilitation rather than just punishment. This was a departure from the retributive approach of the past, where the primary goal was to inflict pain on the offender as a form of recompense. Now the objective was to reform and reintegrate convicts back into society. This change in attitude was reflected in the introduction of parole, a system that allowed prisoners to be released early based on their good behavior. It was a way to incentivize reformation and a testament to the belief that people could change. This was a stark contrast to the prior perception that once a criminal, always a criminal. Probation, on the other hand, was a method of suspending a prison sentence, allowing the offender to live in the community under supervision. This was another attempt at reformation, giving the offender a chance to prove that they could abide by the law without the confines of a prison cell. Alongside these reformative measures, the 20th century also saw the growth of educational and vocational training programs within prisons. These initiatives aimed at equipping prisoners with skills that could help them secure employment upon release, further aiding their reintegration into society. Moreover, psychological treatments and counseling became more prevalent, addressing the mental health aspect of crime and punishment. The understanding that many criminal behaviors stemmed from mental health issues marked another step forward in the evolution of prisons. Yet it's crucial to note that these changes didn't spell the end of problems within the prison system. Overcrowding, violence, and human rights abuses were still rampant in many parts of the world. The shift towards rehabilitation didn't necessarily mean the eradication of punishment, and the balance between the two remained a contentious issue. While prisons were still far from perfect, this marked a significant shift towards our current understanding of the purpose of prisons. So, where does that leave us today? In the contemporary world, prisons are a ubiquitous part of our global society. However, they are not without their share of controversies and challenges. One of the most pressing issues is the problem of overpopulation. Many prisons, especially in highly populated nations, are bursting at the seams. Inmates are often crammed into small, poorly ventilated spaces, which can lead to a host of issues, from health concerns to increased violence. Next, we have the issue of privatization. In some parts of the world, prisons have become a business. Private companies run these institutions for profit, a situation that has raised numerous ethical questions. Critics argue that it creates a perverse incentive to incarcerate more people and can lead to neglect of prisoners' rights and welfare in the pursuit of profit. Then there's the ongoing debate about the purpose of prisons. Are they meant to be punitive or rehabilitative? Should they be a place of punishment where society's rule breakers are sent to pay for their actions? Or should they be an environment where individuals can reform and reintegrate into society? This question has led to a variety of prison models worldwide, from the retributive model that focuses on punishment to the restorative model that emphasizes rehabilitation. But let's not forget about the human rights aspect. Despite being convicted of crimes, prisoners are still entitled to basic human rights. Yet reports of abuse, neglect, and inhumane conditions are all too common. This dichotomy between what should be and what is presents a significant challenge for modern society. Lastly, we must consider the impact of technology. With the advent of digital tools and artificial intelligence, the dynamics of prison management are evolving. These tools can help manage prisons more efficiently, but they also open up new ethical dilemmas. Prisons have come a long way since their inception, but there is still much debate about their role and their effectiveness in society. Prisons, as we've seen, have a long and complex history. From their origins as holding cells for those awaiting trial or execution to their evolution into centers for punishment and rehabilitation, prisons have undergone significant transformations over the centuries. During the Middle Ages, dungeons and towers served as prisons, often subjecting inmates to deplorable conditions. The birth of the penitentiary in the 18th century marked a shift towards viewing prisons as a means of reforming criminals rather than merely punishing them. The 20th century brought further changes, with a focus on human rights leading to improvements in prison conditions. Today, prisons are a combination of all these historical influences, serving as places of punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation. They reflect our society's changing attitudes towards crime and punishment. And yet, as much as prisons have evolved, they continue to stir debate and controversy. The evolution of prisons is a reflection of our changing views on justice and punishment, and who knows what the future may hold.